What I'm about to share with you are 6 of the most disturbing true crime cases that happened during winter. These aren't urban legends or made-up stories. These are real cases where the cold, the snow, and the isolation of winter played a role in horrific crimes. Before we start, I need to warn you that these stories contain graphic descriptions of violence, murder, and survival situations. If that's not something you can handle, stop watching now. For everyone else, let's dive into these winter horror stories. Our first story takes us to the remote mountains of Southern Oregon in November 2006 and involves a family's nightmare that became a national tragedy. James Kim was 35 years old and worked as a senior editor at SNET, one of the leading technology news websites. He was well known in the tech industry, having reviewed products and covered major technology events for years. James was married to Kati Kim, who was 30 years old and worked in sales. They had 2 young daughters, Penelope, who was 4 years old, and Sabine, who was only 7 months old. The family lived in San Francisco, and by all accounts, had a great life together. James was a dedicated father who loved his family deeply. On November 22nd, 2006, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, the Kim family left San Francisco and drove north to Seattle, Washington, to spend the holiday with Kati's family. The drive took about 12 hours, but they made it safely and had a wonderful Thanksgiving celebration with extended family. They spent the weekend in Seattle, enjoying time with Kati's parents and siblings. The girls had fun playing with their cousins. It was a perfect family holiday. On Saturday, November 25th, 2006, the Kim family left Seattle to drive back to San Francisco. They'd originally planned to take Interstate 5 the entire way, which was the main route and the safest in winter. But James had been researching the trip and found what he thought was a more scenic route that would save them some time. This route went through Southern Oregon on smaller highways and back roads. James was an experienced driver and felt confident taking the alternate route. Kati was fine with it. They loaded up their silver Saab station wagon with their luggage and the girls, made sure everyone was buckled in, and started driving south. The drive went smoothly at first. They stopped for lunch at a small restaurant in Roseburg, Oregon. The girls were in good spirits. They continued south on Interstate 5 until they reached Grants Pass, where James exited onto Highway 199. This highway went southwest toward the California coast. It was a beautiful drive with mountains and forests. The weather was clear and cold, but not threatening. They were making good time. Around 3 p.m., they reached the small town of Merlin, Oregon. They stopped at a lodge there to ask about road conditions ahead. The staff told them the main highways were clear, but warned them about taking any side roads because winter weather could make them dangerous. James and Kati thanked them for the information and continued on their way. They stayed on Highway 199 for a while longer. Then James made a decision to turn onto Bear Camp Road. This was a mountain road that cut through the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. According to James's map, Bear Camp Road would take them to Highway 101 on the coast, and from there, it was an easy drive back to San Francisco. What James didn't know was that Bear Camp Road was extremely dangerous in winter. Local residents knew to avoid it from November through March because it went through high elevation areas that got heavy snow. There were multiple forks and turnoffs that were poorly marked. Many of these side roads were old logging roads that led nowhere. But on maps, Bear Camp Road looked like a legitimate route. James had no way of knowing how treacherous it would become. The Kim family turned onto Bear Camp Road around 4 p.m. The sun was starting to set. The road was paved at first, winding through forested areas. Then it started climbing in elevation. The pavement turned to gravel. The trees got denser. As they climbed higher, they started seeing patches of snow on the ground. Then it started snowing. Light flurries at first, then heavier. Within 30 minutes, it was snowing hard. The temperature had dropped significantly. The road became covered in white. James slowed down, driving carefully. He had the headlights on and was following the road as best he could, but visibility was poor. The girls were getting fussy in the back seat. Sabine was crying. Penelope kept asking when they'd get home. Cotty was trying to keep them calm while also watching the road nervously. She suggested maybe they should turn around, but James said they'd gone too far to turn back now. They'd keep going forward and get through this. Then they came to a fork in the road. There should have been signs indicating which way was Bear Camp Road, but there weren't any signs visible. Maybe they were buried in snow. Maybe they'd been knocked down. James had to make a choice. He looked at his map, but in the dark and snow, it was hard to tell exactly where they were. He made a decision and turned left. But this wasn't Bear Camp Road. This was an old logging road called Bear Camp Spur Road. It led deep into the national forest and dead-ended after about 9 miles. The Kim family drove down this logging road with no idea they were going the wrong way. The road got narrower. The snow got deeper. James was still confident they'd eventually connect back to a main road. But the road just kept going, getting progressively worse. The Saab was not built for this kind of terrain. It was a sedan with front-wheel drive, not a four-wheel drive SUV. Finally, about 9 miles down the logging road, around 5:30 p.m., the car got completely stuck in deep snow. The wheels were spinning, but the car wasn't moving forward or backward. They were stuck. James got out and tried to dig the car out. He used his hands and a small shovel they had in the trunk to clear snow from around the tires. He tried putting sticks and branches under the tires for traction. He tried rocking the car back and forth. Nothing worked. The car was stuck solid. It was now fully dark, still snowing heavily, and freezing cold. James got back in the car, covered in snow and shivering. He and Cotty looked at each other, both realizing they were in serious trouble. They had no cell phone service. James tried his phone multiple times. No signal. They were in a mountainous, forested area with no reception. They had no way to call for help. They were on a road that nobody knew they were on, miles from the nearest town, in the middle of a snowstorm. The temperature was dropping rapidly. They had their 2 young daughters with them, including a 7-month-old baby. This was a nightmare scenario. James and Cotty decided they would stay with the car for the night and reassess in the morning. They turned on the engine and ran the heater to keep warm. They bundled the girls in every blanket and jacket they had. Cotty nursed Sabine to keep her fed and calm. Penelope was scared, but her parents tried to keep her calm, telling her it was like a camping adventure. They would periodically turn off the engine to conserve gas, then turn it back on when it got too cold. It was a long, terrifying night. The wind howled outside. Snow piled up around the car. The girls cried. James and Cotty tried to stay positive, but inside, they were terrified. When morning came on November 26th, James got out to assess the situation in daylight. The car was covered in snow. More snow had fallen overnight, probably 8 to 10 inches. The road behind them was completely snowed over. James tried again to get the car unstuck. He dug more snow, tried different techniques. Nothing worked. The car was not moving. He decided to walk back down the road to see if he could find the main road or find help. He told Cotty he'd be back soon. James walked about 3 miles back the way they'd come, following their tire tracks in the snow. It was exhausting. The snow was knee-deep in places. He was wearing jeans, a jacket, and running shoes, not proper snow gear. After walking for hours, James reached the fork where they'd turned wrong. But even from there, he couldn't tell which way was correct. Everything was covered in snow. There were no landmarks he recognized. Defeated and exhausted, James walked back to the car. It took hours. When he got back, he was soaked with sweat and melted snow, freezing cold and completely worn out. Cody and the girls were relieved to see him, but devastated that he hadn't found help. They decided to wait for rescue. Someone would notice they were missing. Search teams would look for them. They just had to survive until help arrived. But nobody was looking for them yet. James had told some friends in San Francisco they'd be back by Sunday, but it wasn't unusual for road trip plans to change. Cody's family in Seattle knew they'd left to drive home, but they assumed the Kims had made it safely. Nobody had any reason to think the Kim family was in trouble. Days passed, Sunday, then Monday. The Kim family was still stranded in their car, stuck on a logging road buried in snow. They were running out of food. They'd had some snacks and drinks in the car, things they'd bought for the road trip. Crackers, granola bars, juice boxes, water bottles. This food was meant to last a few hours of driving, not days of survival. They started rationing everything. They gave most of the food and water to the girls. James and Cody were eating very little, maybe a few crackers a day. Cody was still nursing Sabine, which was keeping the baby alive, but Cody herself was starving and dehydrated. Her milk production was decreasing. The car was running out of gas too. They'd been running the engine periodically to keep warm, but the fuel gauge was getting lower and lower. By Tuesday, they had to stop running the engine entirely. They couldn't risk running out of gas completely because they might need the car's electrical system. Without the heater, the car got brutally cold. At night, temperatures inside the car dropped below freezing. They all huddled together under every blanket, using body heat to stay warm. The girls were crying constantly from cold and hunger. James and Cody were in agony watching their daughters suffer. By Wednesday, December 1st, they'd been stranded for 6 days. They were in desperate condition. The girls were weak and lethargic. Cody was barely producing any milk for Sabine. They'd run out of food 3 days earlier. They'd been eating snow for water, but that was making them colder. James knew they couldn't survive much longer like this. He made a decision. He would hike out and find help. He'd follow the creek drainage that ran alongside the road, figuring it would eventually lead to a river or a valley with people. Cody begged him not to go. She was terrified something would happen to him. But they both knew they were going to die if they stayed. Someone had to try to get help. On the morning of Saturday, December 2nd, 2006, James Kim left his family at the car. He kissed Cody and the girls goodbye. He told them he'd be back with help soon. He started hiking down the creek drainage, following Big Windy Creek downstream. He was wearing jeans, a jacket, his running shoes, and had wrapped some clothes around his head for warmth. It wasn't nearly enough for the conditions. The temperature was in the low 20s. There was snow everywhere. The creek was partially frozen. James started walking. Cody watched James disappear into the forest. She was alone with the 2 girls in a freezing car, with no food and no way to call for help. She didn't know if she'd ever see her husband again. She tried to stay strong for the girls, but inside she was breaking. She kept the girls bundled as tightly as possible. She sang to them. She told them stories. She did everything she could to keep them calm and warm. She also started trying to signal for help. She burned the car's spare tire to create dark smoke, hoping someone would see it. She wrote help in the snow near the car. James hiked for miles. The creek drainage was steep and difficult to navigate. The snow was deep. He had to push through it, sometimes crawling. He was following the creek, but it was slow going. The cold was brutal. James could feel his body temperature dropping. His hands and feet were numb. His clothes were wet from snow and sweat. But he kept going. He had to. His family was counting on him. He hiked all day Saturday. When night fell, he found a spot under some trees and tried to rest. It was the worst night of his life. He shivered uncontrollably all night, barely able to sleep. He knew he was in trouble. Hypothermia was setting in. On Sunday morning, December 3rd, James continued hiking. He was weaker now. Every step was difficult. He was disoriented and confused. Hypothermia was affecting his thinking. He kept going anyway, driven by pure determination to save his family. He walked until he couldn't walk anymore. Then he crawled. He followed the creek, sometimes walking in the creek itself, thinking it might be easier than pushing through the deep snow. This was a fatal mistake. The water was freezing and soaked his clothes completely, accelerating his hypothermia. Meanwhile, back home, people had finally realized the Kim family was missing. James hadn't shown up for work on Monday, which was unusual. When he didn't respond to calls or emails by Tuesday, his co-workers got worried. When Cotty's family couldn't reach them, they called friends. By Wednesday, everyone was panicking. On Thursday, November 30th, Cotty's father filed a missing persons report with police. But where were they? They could have been anywhere between Seattle and San Francisco. That's over 800 miles of possible routes. Investigators started checking hospitals, accident reports, traffic cameras. Nothing. They called hotels and gas stations along Interstate 5. Nobody had seen the Kim family or their silver Saab. Then on Friday, December 1st, someone remembered that James had mentioned taking a scenic route through Oregon. Investigators started looking at alternate routes. They contacted Oregon State Police and asked them to check Bear Camp Road and surrounding areas. Search and rescue teams were activated. On Monday, December 4th, a search helicopter was flying over the Siskiyou National Forest, looking for the Kim's vehicle. The pilot spotted something. It was a silver car on a snow-covered logging road. The helicopter circled lower. It was a Saab station wagon. They'd found the Kim's car. The helicopter landed nearby, and searchers rushed to the vehicle. Inside, they found Cotty and the two girls. They were alive, but barely. They'd been stranded for 9 days. Cotty was severely hypothermic, dehydrated, and malnourished. She'd lost significant weight. The girls were in critical condition. Sabine was especially bad, having survived on Cotty's depleted breast milk. Rescuers got the car door open. Cotty looked at them with tears streaming down her face. She could barely speak. "My husband," she whispered. "James, he went for help 5 days ago. Find him. Please find him." The rescuers immediately radioed for more helicopters. They airlifted Cotty, Penelope, and Sabine to the nearest hospital. Medical teams worked to treat their hypothermia and dehydration. The doctors said if they'd been found even 12 hours later, the baby might not have survived. But they were going to make it. They were saved. Now the focus shifted to finding James. Search teams mobilized. Helicopters began searching along Big Windy Creek, where Cotty said James had gone. Ground search teams started hiking the creek drainage. They were looking for any sign of James. They called his name. They searched everywhere. The weather was still terrible, with snow and cold temperatures. If James had been out there for 5 days in these conditions, he was almost certainly dead. But they had to try to find him. On Wednesday, December 6th, 2 days after finding the car, search teams found James's body. He was in Big Windy Creek, about 10 miles from where he'd started. He was partially in the water, wedged between some rocks. He'd removed his pants at some point, which is a classic sign of severe hypothermia. When people are dying from hypothermia, they sometimes experience a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, where they feel extremely hot and start removing clothes even though they're freezing. James had likely been in the final stages of hypothermia when he took off his pants. The medical examiner determined James had died from hypothermia. He'd probably died sometime on Sunday, December 3rd, about 30 hours after leaving the car. He'd hiked approximately 10 miles through brutal conditions before his body gave out. He'd been trying so hard to save his family. He'd pushed himself beyond what most people could endure. But the cold had been too much. James Kim had died trying to be a hero. The news of James's death devastated everyone who knew him. His friends and colleagues from CNET were heartbroken. The tech community mourned his loss, but most devastated were Cotty and the girls. When Cotty was told that James had been found dead, she collapsed. She'd been holding on to hope that maybe he'd made it, that maybe he was safe somewhere. Learning he'd died was unbearable. Cotty had to come to terms with the fact that her husband had died trying to save them. She'd watched him walk away into the snow and would never see him alive again. The investigation into what went wrong found multiple factors. The Kims had made a wrong turn onto a logging road that should have been gated closed, but wasn't. The signage at the fork was inadequate. The weather had turned severe unexpectedly. The Kims didn't have proper winter survival gear in their car. They'd taken a route they weren't familiar with without researching it thoroughly enough. It was a series of decisions and circumstances that led to tragedy. In the aftermath, changes were made to Bear Camp Road. Better signage was installed. Gates were placed at the entrances to logging roads with clear warnings. A winter closure system was implemented. These changes might prevent future tragedies, but they came too late for James Kim. Cotty Kim eventually wrote a book about the ordeal. She spoke publicly about what happened, about the 9 days stranded, about losing James. She raised her daughters as a single mother, keeping James's memory alive. Penelope and Sabine grew up knowing their father had died saving them. They grew up knowing he was a hero. Now, if you're finding this content compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Let's move on to our second story. This next case takes us to West Valley City, Utah, in December 2009, and involves a woman named Susan Powell, who disappeared under suspicious circumstances during a snowstorm. Susan Cox Powell was 28 years old. She was born in West Virginia, but grew up in Washington State. Susan was petite, about 5'4", with brown hair and a bright smile. She'd married Joshua Powell in 2001 when she was just 20. They'd met at a church event and dated for about a year before getting married. Josh and Susan moved to Utah in 2004 for Josh's job. They bought a house in West Valley City, a suburb of Salt Lake City. They had 2 sons together. Charlie was born in 2005 and Braden in 2007. From the outside, they looked like a normal young family. But behind closed doors, things were not okay. Susan and Josh's marriage was troubled. Josh was controlling and emotionally abusive. He monitored Susan's spending, her phone calls, her activities. He criticized her constantly. Susan confided in friends that she was unhappy, but she stayed in the marriage for the sake of their sons. Another issue was Josh's father, Stephen Powell. Stephen was a strange man who made Susan extremely uncomfortable. He was obsessed with Susan in an inappropriate way. He would stare at her. He took photos of her without permission, sometimes in their bathroom. He wrote disturbing things about Susan in his personal journals. Susan told friends that Stephen gave her the creeps, and she didn't want to be around him. But Josh insisted they maintain a relationship with his father. In December 2009, Susan was working as a stockbroker. She was good at her job and was one of the main breadwinners for the family, which Josh resented. Susan had also been talking to friends about possibly leaving Josh. She'd looked into divorce lawyers. She'd told her friend that if anything ever happened to her, Josh would be responsible. She'd written this in her will and in private notes. Susan seemed to know she was in danger. On Sunday, December 6, 2009, Susan went to church in the morning with her sons, while Josh stayed home. Susan attended their LDS ward regularly. After church, Susan took Charlie and Braden to see a friend's children. They spent the afternoon together. Susan seemed normal, happy even. That evening, Susan returned home with the boys around 5 p.m. She made dinner for the family. They ate together. After dinner, Susan put the boys in their pajamas and was getting them ready for bed. Around 8 p.m. that evening, Neighbors heard the Powell family's minivan start up and drive away. This was unusual because it was late on a Sunday night and cold. There was a winter storm watch in effect for the area with snow forecast to start later that evening. But Josh had taken the boys and left. When neighbors asked later where they'd gone, Josh said he'd taken the boys camping at 8 p.m. in December with a storm coming, with 2 small children, ages 4 and 2. When Josh and the boys returned home the next morning around 12:30 p.m., on Monday, December 7th, Susan wasn't with them. Josh told people who asked that Susan had gone to work, but Susan never showed up at work on Monday. Her colleagues called the house looking for her. Josh said Susan had left early for work and he didn't know where she was. By Monday evening, Susan's friends and family were very worried. Susan wasn't answering her phone. She wasn't at work. Nobody had seen her since Sunday night. Something was very wrong on Tuesday, December 8th, when Susan still hadn't appeared or contacted anyone. Her friends called the police to do a welfare check. Officers went to the Powell house. Josh answered the door and seemed surprised and confused about why police were there. When asked where Susan was, Josh said she was probably at work. Officers explained that Susan had not been at work for 2 days and nobody had heard from her. Josh seemed unconcerned. He suggested maybe Susan had run off or was having an affair. Officers found this response strange. "Your wife is missing and you don't seem worried." Officers asked Josh about his whereabouts on Sunday night. Josh told them he'd taken the boys camping. The officers were incredulous. "You took 2 toddlers camping at 8 p.m. on a Sunday night in December with a storm coming?" Josh insisted, yes, they'd gone camping. He said Susan was supposed to come meet them, but she never showed up. He said when he and the boys came home Monday morning, Susan wasn't home. He assumed she'd gone to work. The officers knew this story made no sense, but Josh stuck to it. Police got a search warrant for the Powell house. When they entered, they found several concerning things. 2 box fans were running in the living room, even though it was December and cold outside. The fans seemed to be positioned to dry a wet spot on the couch. When police tested the couch, they found evidence it had been recently cleaned with cleaning solution. The fans and the cleaned couch suggested Josh was trying to eliminate evidence. In the master bedroom, police found Susan's purse, her wallet, her identification, and her cell phone. All of these were things Susan would have taken with her if she'd gone to work or left voluntarily. But they were still in the house. Police also noticed Susan's winter coats were still in the closet. If Susan had gone somewhere in December, she would have worn a coat. Everything pointed to Susan not having left the house voluntarily. Police searched the rest of the house. In the laundry room, they found cleaning supplies and a mop bucket with dirty water. In the garage, they found a shop vacuum. All of these suggested Josh had been doing extensive cleaning. Police also brought in cadaver dogs. The dogs alerted to the back of the Powell's minivan, indicating a dead body had been in there at some point. But there was no body, no blood, no physical evidence of a homicide, just the suspicious circumstances. Josh was taken in for questioning. He maintained his camping story. He said he'd driven with Charlie and Braden to the West Desert area near Simpson Springs, about 100 miles west of Salt Lake City. He said they'd gone to an area he'd scouted before. They'd roasted marshmallows and the boys had slept in the van. Josh said he'd fallen asleep too, and when he woke up, it was early Monday morning. He'd driven home thinking Susan would be there or at work. Investigators knew this story was full of holes, but without a body or concrete evidence, they couldn't prove Josh was lying. Police checked Josh's GPS and cell phone data. The GPS showed Josh had driven to the West Desert area on Sunday night. His phone pinged off a tower out there around 11 p.m. So he had been where he said he was, but that didn't mean his story was true. Josh could have driven out there after doing something to Susan. The trip could have been to dispose of Susan's body, not to camp with the kids. Search teams were mobilized. They searched the West Desert area where Josh claimed to have camped. They searched for any sign of Susan. The weather was terrible. A winter storm had dumped significant snow on the area Monday night into Tuesday. If Susan's body was out there, it was now covered in snow. Search teams used dogs, helicopters, ground searches. They covered hundreds of square miles. They found nothing. No trace of Susan. Police also searched the Powell house more thoroughly. They dug up the backyard looking for a grave. They searched nearby parks and open spaces. They drained the family's pool, even though it was winter. They checked every place they thought Josh might have hidden Susan's body. Nothing. Susan had vanished without a trace. Days turned into weeks. Susan was still missing. Her family was desperate. They knew Josh had killed her, but they couldn't prove it. Josh hired a lawyer and stopped cooperating with police. He packed up his house and moved with his sons to his father Stephen's house in Washington State. The investigation continued. Police learned more about Susan and Josh's troubled marriage. Friends gave statements about how controlling and abusive Josh had been. They shared emails and journal entries from Susan expressing fear of Josh. One particularly chilling detail was that Susan had written in her journal that she was afraid Josh would kill her and make it look like an accident or make her disappear. She documented her fear in writing, knowing something might happen to her. Police also discovered that Josh had taken out a large life insurance policy on Susan shortly before her disappearance. He'd also made unusual financial moves, withdrawing money from accounts, canceling Susan's credit cards. It looked like Josh had been planning something. But none of this was enough to arrest him without Susan's body. Years passed. Susan was never found. Police continued to treat her case as a homicide investigation with Josh as the prime suspect. Josh kept custody of Charlie and Braden because he hadn't been charged with a crime. Susan's parents fought for custody of the boys, but lost because Josh was the father and had legal rights. The boys lived with Josh at Stephen Powell's house in Washington. Then in 2011, Stephen Powell was arrested on child pornography charges. Police had raided his house looking for evidence in Susan's case and found thousands of images of child pornography on his computers. They also found disturbing images Stephen had taken of Susan without her knowledge, including photos of her in the bathroom. Stephen was convicted and sent to prison. This meant Josh and the boys had to move out of Stephen's house. The investigation into Susan's disappearance continued. Police found evidence that Josh had researched how to hide a body, had looked up mine shafts and caves in the West Desert area, had searched for information about decomposition. All of this suggested premeditation, but they still had no body. In early 2012, Josh Powell was called to take a psychosexual evaluation as part of the custody case. The evaluation and other evidence led a judge to order that Josh could only have supervised visits with his sons while the investigation was ongoing. On February 5, 2012, a social worker brought Charlie and Braden to Josh's rental house in Washington for a supervised visit. The social worker walked the boys to the door. Josh opened the door, grabbed the boys, and pulled them inside. Then he slammed the door and locked it, leaving the social worker outside. The social worker tried the door, but it was locked. She called 911 immediately, telling the dispatcher that something was wrong, that Josh had locked her out, and she could smell gasoline. Emergency services were dispatched. But before they could arrive, there was an explosion. Josh had poured gasoline throughout the house. He'd also attacked Charlie and Braden with a hatchet, inflicting fatal injuries to their heads and necks. Then he'd ignited the gasoline. The house exploded into flames and burned completely. Josh Powell had murdered his two sons and killed himself. Charlie and Braden died horrifically at the hands of their father. They were 7 and 5 years old. The house fire was so intense that it took hours to put out. When firefighters finally got inside, they found 3 bodies. Josh, Charlie, and Braden were all dead. The medical examiner determined the boys had died from hatchet wounds to the head before the fire. Josh had died from smoke inhalation and burns. He'd murdered his children and then let the fire kill him. The explosion destroyed any evidence that might have been in Josh's house. If Josh had kept notes or maps about where he'd hidden Susan's body, they burned. If there had been any physical evidence linking him definitively to Susan's murder, it was gone. The truth about what happened to Susan died with Josh. To this day, Susan Powell's body has never been found. Her family holds out hope that one day someone will discover her remains and she can be properly buried. But that day hasn't come yet. The prevailing theory is that Josh killed Susan on Sunday night, December 6th, 2009. He probably smothered her or strangled her in their home, possibly on the couch, which would explain why he'd cleaned it. Then, he put her body in the back of the minivan, which would explain the cadaver dog hits. He took the boys with him, probably because he had no choice, and drove out to the West Desert area. There, while the boys were asleep in the van, Josh disposed of Susan's body. He probably put her in a mine shaft or cave, or buried her. The area has hundreds of abandoned mines and vast empty terrain. The snowstorm that night would have covered his tracks. By the time Josh drove home Monday morning, Susan was hidden somewhere in the desert, and the falling snow had erased any evidence of his activities. Susan Cox Powell was 28 years old when she disappeared. She'd been a loving mother who adored her sons. She'd been planning to leave her abusive marriage. She'd known she was in danger and had tried to document it, but that hadn't saved her. Her sons, Charlie and Braden, grew up without their mother and were ultimately murdered by their father. 3 lives destroyed by Josh Powell's violence. Let's move on to our third story now. This case takes us to rural Wisconsin in the fall of 2005 and involves one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern American history. On October 31st, 2005, Halloween Day, a 25-year-old photographer named Teresa Halbach disappeared. Teresa worked for Auto Trader magazine, going to people's homes and businesses to photograph vehicles they wanted to sell. The photos would appear in the Auto Trader publication. It was a job that required Teresa to drive all over Wisconsin, often alone, to meet strangers. On that Monday, October 31st, Teresa had several photography appointments scheduled. She left her home in Hilbert, Wisconsin, around noon. Her first few appointments went fine. She photographed a few vehicles, got the shots she needed, and moved on to her next locations. Her last appointment of the day was at the Avery Auto Salvage Yard in the town of Two Rivers in Manitowoc County. This was a family-run business that bought wrecked cars, sold parts, and had acres of junked vehicles on their property. The Avery family had called Auto Trader and specifically requested Teresa Halbach to come photograph a 1999 Dodge Caravan they wanted to sell. The call had been made by a man who gave the name B. Janda and left a phone number. The number actually belonged to Stephen Avery, one of the family members who lived on the salvage yard property. Stephen had a history with the police in Manitowoc County. He'd been wrongfully convicted of sexual assault in 1985 and had spent 18 years in prison before DNA evidence exonerated him in 2003. After his release, Stephen had filed a $36 million lawsuit against Manitowoc County for the wrongful conviction. Teresa arrived at the Avery property around 2:30 p.m. on October 31st. She drove her blue 1999 Toyota RAV4 onto the property, which was about 40 acres of old cars, scrap metal, and various buildings and trailers where family members lived. Stephen Avery lived in a small trailer with his girlfriend, Jody Stokowski. Other family members, including Stephen's brothers, his parents, and his nephews, lived in various structures on the property. Teresa met with Stephen, took photos of the minivan he wanted to sell, and collected payment. Several people saw Teresa on the property. Stephen's teenage nephew, Brendan Dassey, saw her. Bobby Dassey, Brendan's older brother, saw Teresa's vehicle. Everything seemed routine. Teresa finished the job and left the property around 2:45 p.m. She was seen driving away by Bobby Dassey, who was out hunting. Teresa never made it home that day. When she didn't return by evening and didn't answer calls from her family, her roommate and her parents became worried. By November 3rd, when Teresa still hadn't been seen or heard from, her family reported her missing. Police started investigating immediately. They tracked Teresa's schedule on October 31st and determined the Avery salvage yard had been her last stop. Officers went to the property to ask questions. Stephen Avery told police that Teresa had come, taken photos of the van, and left. He said he'd paid her in cash and watched her drive away. He didn't know where she'd gone after that. Police asked if they could search the property. Stephen said yes, go ahead. Officers did a preliminary search, but didn't find anything unusual. Teresa's RAV4 was not on the property. Police left, but continued investigating other leads. On November 5th, 2005, 4 days after Teresa disappeared, volunteer searchers were allowed onto the Avery property to help look for any clues. Among the volunteers were Teresa's cousin and her cousin's daughter. They were searching the far edges of the 40-acre property when they found something. Hidden among rows of junked cars, partially covered with branches, plywood, and a car hood, was Teresa's blue RAV4. They immediately called police. Police secured the scene and got search warrants for the entire property. The RAV4 was processed carefully. The license plates had been removed and were found in a different car on the property. The interior of the RAV4 had been wiped down, but investigators found blood. DNA testing confirmed it was Teresa's blood. They also found blood that didn't belong to Teresa. Further DNA testing matched that blood to Stephen Avery. Stephen's blood was inside Teresa's vehicle, on the dashboard, near the ignition, and on the back door. This was extremely damning evidence. The discovery of Teresa's vehicle on the Avery property made Stephen the prime suspect. On November 9th, Stephen Avery was arrested for possession of a firearm by a felon, which was a violation of his parole from a previous charge. This gave police a reason to hold him while they continued investigating Teresa's disappearance. Meanwhile, investigators brought in multiple search teams, cadaver dogs, and forensic experts to process the entire Avery property. On November 8th, investigators found Teresa's car key in Stephen's bedroom. It was discovered on the floor near a bookshelf after multiple previous searches of the room had failed to find it. The key had Stephen's DNA on it, but not Teresa's, which seemed strange. On November 9th, investigators found charred bone fragments in a burn pit behind Stephen's trailer. The bones were heavily burned and fragmented. They were sent to forensic anthropologists for analysis. The forensic analysis determined the bones were human remains. DNA testing on small pieces of tissue and bone marrow that hadn't been completely destroyed confirmed the remains were Teresa Halbach's. Teresa had been murdered, her body burned, and her remains left in the burn pit. Investigators also found Teresa's cell phone, camera, and PDA in a burn barrel on the property. These items had been partially burned but were identifiable. On November 11th, 2005, Stephen Avery was formally charged with first-degree intentional homicide in the death of Teresa Halbach. The evidence against him was substantial. Teresa's vehicle was hidden on his property. Her remains were in his burn pit. Her belongings were in his burn barrel. His blood was in her vehicle. Her key was in his bedroom. The prosecutor believed Stephen had lured Teresa to the property killed her, burned her body, and tried to hide the evidence. The motive was unclear, but might have been sexual assault. But Stephen maintained his innocence. He said he was being framed. He claimed Manitowoc County Police had a vendetta against him because of his pending lawsuit and were planting evidence to frame him for Teresa's murder. His defense team, led by attorneys Dean Strang and Jerome Bouting, argued that the investigation was biased and that evidence had been planted or contaminated. They pointed out that Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department officers had found key pieces of evidence, even though they were supposed to have recused themselves from the investigation due to Stephen's lawsuit against them. The defense presented alternative theories. They suggested Teresa's vehicle could have been driven onto the property by someone else after Teresa left. They suggested Stephen's blood could have been planted in the RAV4. They noted that a vial of Stephen's blood from his 1985 case had been accessed and had a needle hole in the stopper, suggesting someone might have drawn blood from it. They suggested the key had been planted in Stephen's bedroom, which would explain why multiple searches didn't find it, but then it suddenly appeared. They argued the investigation was rushed and focused solely on Stephen while ignoring other possibilities. But there was another layer to this case that made it even more controversial. Stephen's 16-year-old nephew, Brendan Dassey, was also arrested in connection with Teresa's murder. Brendan had special needs and cognitive limitations. He had a low IQ and struggled in school. On March 1st, 2006, investigators brought Brendan in for questioning. Without a parent or attorney present, they interrogated Brendan for several hours. During this interrogation, Brendan confessed to helping Stephen kill Teresa. Brendan's confession was detailed and horrific. He described how Stephen had called him over to his trailer. When Brendan got there, he said Teresa was chained to Stephen's bed. Brendan said Stephen told him to rape Teresa. Brendan said he did. Then Stephen stabbed Teresa and told Brendan to stab her too. Brendan said he did. Then they shot Teresa. Brendan described carrying Teresa's body to the burn pit, pouring gasoline and motor oil on her, and burning the body. He described watching Teresa's body burn for hours, using a shovel and rake to break up the bones. But Brendan's confession was controversial from the start. He had the mental capacity of a young child. The interrogation tactics used by investigators seemed coercive. They suggested answers to Brendan, leading him to say what they wanted to hear. Brendan's statements were inconsistent. He changed details throughout multiple interrogations. In some statements, he said Teresa was shot in the head in Stephen's garage. In others, he said she was shot outside near the burn pit. His descriptions of Teresa being in the trailer didn't match any physical evidence. Despite extensive searches of Stephen's trailer, investigators found no blood, no DNA from Teresa, no evidence she'd ever been inside. Brendan's defense attorneys argued the confession was false, coerced from a mentally limited teenager who was manipulated by adult investigators. But the confession was allowed as evidence. Brendan Dassey was charged as an adult with first-degree intentional homicide, mutilation of a corpse, and first-degree sexual assault. He was tried separately from Stephen. Stephen Avery's trial took place first in winter 2007. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution presented all the physical evidence linking Stephen to the crime. They called forensic experts, law enforcement officers, and witnesses. They presented the blood evidence, the DNA evidence, the remains found in the burn pit, the key found in Stephen's bedroom, the bullet found in Stephen's garage that had Teresa's DNA on it. They argued Stephen had shot Teresa in his garage after possibly assaulting her, then burned her body to destroy evidence. The defense attacked the integrity of the investigation. They called their own experts who questioned the handling and processing of evidence. They pointed out contamination issues. They demonstrated how evidence could have been planted. They argued that Manitowoc County had the motive, means, and opportunity to frame Stephen. They noted that several pieces of key evidence were found by Manitowoc officers who were supposed to be recused from the case. They argued the investigation was a rush to judgment against Stephen while other suspects were never seriously investigated. The jury deliberated for 4 days. On March 18, 2007, they returned with a verdict. Guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. Guilty of mutilation of a corpse. Stephen Avery was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was also given additional consecutive sentences on the other charges. Stephen Avery would spend the rest of his life in prison for killing Teresa Halbach. Brendan Dassey's trial took place in April 2007. The prosecution's case against Brendan relied heavily on his confession. They presented little physical evidence linking Brendan to the crime. No DNA, no blood, no forensic evidence. Just his confession and some inconsistent statements. The defense argued Brendan was coerced, that the confession was false, that investigators had fed him information and pressured him into admitting to things he didn't do. They presented expert testimony about false confessions and how easily people with cognitive limitations can be manipulated. But the jury convicted Brendan on all counts. On August 2, 2007, Brendan Dassey, who was 17 at sentencing, was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 41 years. He would be 58 years old before he could even be considered for parole. Brendan would spend his entire youth and adult life in prison for a crime he may or may not have committed. Both Stephen and Brendan filed appeals. Stephen's appeals have been unsuccessful. Courts have upheld his conviction, finding that even if there were issues with the investigation, there was sufficient evidence to convict him. Brendan's case has been more complicated. In 2016, a federal magistrate overturned Brendan's conviction, finding that his confession was involuntary and that his attorneys had provided inadequate defense. Brendan was briefly ordered released. But the state of Wisconsin appealed, and in 2017, a federal appeals court reversed the decision and reinstated Brendan's conviction. Brendan remains in prison. The case gained massive attention in 2015 when Netflix released a documentary series called Making a Murderer. The series presented the case from the defense perspective, arguing that Stephen and Brendan were wrongfully convicted. The documentary showed what appeared to be investigative misconduct, planted evidence, and coerced confessions. Millions of people watched the series, and many became convinced Stephen and Brendan were innocent. The case sparked enormous public debate, but critics of the documentary point out it was one-sided. It didn't present the full evidence against Stephen. It didn't include many of the facts that made Stephen look guilty. Prosecutors and investigators involved in the case have defended their work, arguing the evidence against Stephen was overwhelming and the investigation was thorough and legitimate. The truth about what happened to Teresa Halbach may never be fully known. Stephen Avery maintains his innocence and continues to file appeals. Brendan Dassey maintains his innocence, and his case has garnered support from groups fighting false confessions. But both remain in prison, convicted of murdering Teresa Halbach on October 31, 2005. What is certain is that Teresa Halbach was a real person whose life was stolen. She was 25 years old, working as a photographer, living her life. She went to the Avery property to do her job and never came home. Her family has had to endure not only her death, but years of public scrutiny, multiple trials, endless appeals, and a documentary that reopened their wounds. Teresa's mother and siblings have repeatedly asked for privacy, saying they know who killed Teresa, and they want the case to be over so they can grieve in peace. Now, before we continue to the next story, hit that like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you think. Let's move on to our fourth story. This case takes us to central Pennsylvania in November 2013 and involves a newlywed couple who committed murder together. Elite Barber was 22 years old and Miranda Barber was 18. They'd met online through a website for people interested in alternative lifestyles. Both of them claimed to be into dark and violent things. They talked about their shared interest in death, Satanism, and serial killers. After just a few weeks of knowing each other, they decided to get married. They were married in North Carolina in October 2013, just 3 weeks before committing murder together. After getting married, Alita and Miranda moved to Selinsgrove, Pennsylvania, where they rented a small apartment. They were both unemployed. Miranda had been in and out of foster care and treatment facilities as a teenager. She'd been diagnosed with various mental health issues. Alita came from a troubled background as well. They were two damaged young people who fed off each other's darkness. In early November 2013, Miranda started posting ads on Craigslist. She posted in the casual encounters section under women seeking men. Her ads offered companionship in exchange for money. She was essentially advertising as an escort, though the ads were vaguely worded. Several men responded to Miranda's ads. She would chat with them, flirt, make plans. But her intentions were not what these men thought. Miranda and Elite had decided they wanted to kill someone together. They saw it as a twisted bonding experience for their new marriage. Miranda's ads were bait to lure a victim. One of the men who responded to Miranda's ad was 42-year-old Troy LaFerrara. Troy lived in Port Trevorton, Pennsylvania, with his wife Colleen and their 2 children. Troy worked as a machinist at a local factory. He'd been married to Colleen for 18 years. Why Troy was responding to casual encounter ads on Craigslist? That's a question his family would struggle with. Maybe he was looking for an affair. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe he had problems in his marriage. Whatever his reasons, it was a fatal decision. Troy and Miranda exchanged messages and texts for several days. They sent photos back and forth. Troy sent pictures of himself. Miranda sent pictures that were likely not actually her or were heavily filtered. They discussed meeting in person. Miranda told Troy she'd provide companionship for $100. Troy agreed. They made plans to meet on the evening of Monday, November 11th, 2013. Miranda told Troy to meet her at the Susquehanna Valley Mall in Selinsgrove around 9 p.m. On the evening of November 11th, Troy told his wife Colleen he had to run an errand. He got in his car and drove to the mall, about 25 minutes from his home. He arrived around 9 p.m. and looked for Miranda. He saw a red Honda CR-V in the parking lot with a young woman sitting in the driver's seat. That was Miranda. Troy parked his car and walked over to the CR-V. He got in the passenger seat. Miranda was friendly and flirty. She told Troy she knew a place they could go for privacy. Troy agreed. What Troy didn't know was that Alita was hiding in the back seat under a blanket. He'd been there the whole time, waiting. Miranda started the car and drove out of the mall parking lot. She headed toward a more industrial area of town. Troy probably thought they were going to a motel or Miranda's apartment. He had no idea he was being driven to his death. Miranda drove to Sunbury, a nearby town. She pulled into an alley behind some buildings in an industrial area. It was dark, cold, and there was nobody around. When Miranda parked the car and turned off the engine, Troy probably asked why they were stopping there. That's when Elite sat up from the back seat. Before Troy could react, Alita wrapped a cord around Troy's neck from behind and started strangling him. Troy fought back. He was a grown man being attacked by a younger, smaller person. He thrashed and grabbed at the cord, trying to pull it away from his neck. He was gasping for air, but Miranda pulled out a knife. She'd been holding it the whole time, waiting for this moment. She started stabbing Troy repeatedly. She stabbed him in the chest, in the ribs, in the back. Troy was being strangled from behind and stabbed from the front. He didn't stand a chance. Within a few minutes, Troy LaFerrara was dead. He slumped forward in the passenger seat, blood everywhere. Elite and Miranda sat there for a moment, breathing heavily, looking at what they'd done. They'd just killed a man together. Miranda would later say it felt powerful, like they were gods deciding who lived and died. They sat with Troy's body for a while, not speaking, just processing what they'd done. Then they needed to deal with the body. They couldn't just leave it in the car. They dragged Troy's body out of the CRV. He was heavy and it was difficult. They managed to pull him a few yards away from the car and left him on the ground, partially covered with a tarp they found in the alley. Then they got back in the car and drove home. Miranda was covered in blood. So was Elite. They went to their apartment, took showers, and went to bed. The next morning, November 12th, a homeless man who slept in that area found Troy's body. He immediately called 911. Police responded and secured the scene. Troy had been strangled and stabbed more than 20 times. His wallet, phone, and keys were missing. This was clearly a homicide. Investigators started trying to figure out who Troy was and what he'd been doing in Sunbury. Troy's wife, Colleen, had reported him missing the night before when he didn't come home from his errand. When police contacted her to notify her that a body matching Troy's description had been found, she had to come identify him. It was Troy. Colleen was devastated. She had to tell her children their father was dead. She also had to deal with the fact that Troy had been in a part of town he had no reason to be in, suggesting he was meeting someone for something he shouldn't have been doing. Investigators pulled surveillance footage from the mall where Troy's car was found. The footage showed Troy arriving at 9 p.m. It showed him walking to a red Honda CRV and getting inside. The CRV then left the parking lot with Troy in the passenger seat. Investigators worked to identify the CRV. They got a partial license plate number from the footage. They ran searches in the Pennsylvania DMV database for red Honda CRVs matching that partial plate. They found several possibilities and started investigating them. One of the CRVs was registered to Miranda Barber. Police went to the address on file for Miranda, the apartment in Selinsgrove where she lived with Elite. When they knocked on the door on November 14th, 3 days after the murder, Miranda and Elite answered. Police asked if they could ask some questions. Miranda and Elite agreed and were taken to the police station for interviews. Initially, both Miranda and Elite denied knowing Troy or having anything to do with his death, but investigators had evidence. They had the surveillance footage showing Troy getting into Miranda's car. They had cell phone records showing Miranda and Troy had been texting each other. They had Miranda's Craigslist ads. The evidence was piling up. After hours of interrogation, Miranda broke down and confessed. Miranda admitted she'd posted the Craigslist ads. She admitted Troy had responded. She admitted she'd arranged to meet him at the mall. She described how she and Elite had planned to kill whoever showed up. She described the murder in detail, how Elite had strangled Troy while she stabbed him, how they dumped his body. She provided information only the killers would know. Her confession was chilling because of how matter-of-fact she was about it. She showed no remorse. She said they'd killed Troy because they wanted to know what it felt like. Elite also confessed. He corroborated Miranda's story. They'd planned this together. They'd wanted to kill someone. Troy was just the unlucky person who responded to the ad. Elite said he didn't feel bad about it. He said Troy was stupid for meeting a girl from Craigslist and deserved what he got. The callousness of their statements shocked investigators. But then Miranda said something that made national headlines. She claimed Troy wasn't the first person she'd killed. She told investigators she'd murdered at least 22 people over the past 6 years, starting when she was 13 years old. She claimed she'd killed people in Alaska, North Carolina, Texas, and California. She said she was part of a satanic cult and the murders were sacrifices. She described different methods, different victims, different locations. She said some victims were strangers, some were people she knew. Investigators were skeptical but had to take her claims seriously. They contacted police departments in every jurisdiction Miranda mentioned. They looked for unsolved murders that matched her descriptions. They searched for missing persons cases. They investigated every lead, but they found nothing. No bodies, no evidence, no missing persons reports that lined up with Miranda's claims. Most investigators concluded Miranda was lying, making up stories to seem more dangerous and notorious than she actually was. Serial killers often exaggerate their victim counts for attention. Miranda likely killed only Troy LaFerrara and was fabricating the rest. Miranda Barber and Elite Barber were both charged with first-degree murder, criminal conspiracy, robbery, and abuse of a corpse. The evidence against them was overwhelming. They'd confessed. There was physical evidence linking them to the crime scene. Troy's blood was in their car. Their DNA was on Troy's body. It was an open and shut case. Their attorneys advised them to plead guilty to avoid the death penalty. Both agreed. In Chayes, September 2014, Miranda pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences totaling life, plus 40 years. She'll die in prison. Alita pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He was also sentenced to life without parole. Both were 19 and 23 years old at sentencing. They'll spend the rest of their lives in prison for killing Troy LaFerrara. Troy's family had to cope with his death and with the circumstances. Troy had made a bad decision responding to that Craigslist ad. Maybe he was looking for an affair, maybe something else. But whatever his intentions, he didn't deserve to be murdered. His wife Colleen had to grieve while also dealing with anger at Troy for putting himself in that situation. His children lost their father. The family had to read all the details of the case in the news, including Troy's Craigslist communications with Miranda. It was humiliating on top of tragic. Miranda Barber is currently housed at SCI Muncie, a women's prison in Pennsylvania. She's given several media interviews over the years. Sometimes she claims her confession was coerced, that Alita forced her to participate in Troy's murder. Other times she brags about being a killer and hints that her claims about 22 victims were true. She changes her story depending on who she's talking to. Most people don't believe her claims about multiple murders. She's likely a one-time killer who wants attention and notoriety. Let's continue with our fifth story. This takes us to the White Mountains of New Hampshire in February 2004 and involves one of the most mysterious disappearances in modern history. 21-year-old Maura Murray was a nursing student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She was in her junior year and seemed to have her life together. Maura was smart, athletic, and popular. She ran track for UMass. She had a boyfriend, friends, and good grades. But behind this facade, Maura was struggling with things nobody knew about. In early February 2004, Maura's behavior became erratic. On the evening of February 5th, Maura was working her campus security job. Part of her job was answering phones and monitoring the security desk. At around 1 a.m. on February 6th, Maura received a phone call. After the call, Maura's supervisor found her completely distraught. She was sobbing uncontrollably, shaking, unable to function. The supervisor was concerned and asked what was wrong. Maura wouldn't say. She just kept crying. The supervisor decided to drive Maura back to her dorm room because she was clearly in no state to work. The next day, Maura seemed fine. She went to classes as normal. She went to track practice. Her friends said she seemed like regular Maura. Whatever had upset her the night before seemed to have passed, but something was going on beneath the surface that nobody could see. On Monday, February 9th, 2004, Maura went to her classes in the morning. She seemed normal. But after her classes, Maura went back to her dorm room and started packing. She packed almost all her belongings, stuffing clothes and personal items into boxes and bags. She took down the posters from her walls. She packed up her room like she was moving out. She left her textbooks and school supplies, taking only personal items and clothes. Around 1 p.m., Maura sent emails to her professors and her work supervisor. The email said there had been a death in the family, and she needed to be away from school for a week. But this was a lie. There had been no death in Maura's family. Everyone was fine. Why Maura sent these false emails, nobody knows. Around 2:40 p.m., Maura went to an ATM near campus and withdrew $280, almost all the money in her account. Surveillance footage from the ATM shows Maura looking somber but composed. Around 3:15 p.m., Maura went to a local liquor store and bought alcohol. She bought a bottle of vodka, a bottle of Kahlua, a bottle of Bailey's, and a box of wine. The total was about $40. She put the alcohol in her car. Then Maura got in her black 1996 Saturn sedan and left Amherst. She was driving north. Before leaving, Maura had printed out directions to Burlington, Vermont, and to various locations in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. It's unclear which destination she was actually heading toward. Maura drove north on Interstate 91, then took Route 112 east toward the White Mountains. It was winter. The roads were clear in some areas, but icy and snow-covered in others. Maura drove for hours. By early evening, she was on Route 112 in the White Mountains near the town of Haverhill, New Hampshire. This is a very rural, mountainous area with few houses and businesses. At approximately 7:27 p.m., Maura's car crashed. Route 112 has a sharp curve near a place called the Weathered Barn Curve. The road was icy. Maura's car went off the road and hit some trees. The crash wasn't severe, but it damaged the front end of the car. The windshield cracked, the airbags deployed. But the car was still running and appeared drivable. Maura was shaken but not visibly injured. She stayed in her car after the crash, probably trying to decide what to do. A school bus driver named Butch Atwood was driving home from his route. He came around the curve and saw Maura's car crashed into the trees. Butch stopped to help. He walked over to the car and saw Maura inside. He knocked on the window. Maura rolled it down. Butch asked if she was okay and if she needed help. Maura said she was fine. Butch asked if she wanted him to call police or an ambulance. Maura said no, she'd already called CHPCA and they were coming. Butch was skeptical of this because cell phones didn't get service in that area, but he didn't argue with her. Butch told Maura he was going to call police anyway to report the accident. Maura seemed unhappy about this, but didn't protest. Butch got back in his bus and drove to his house, which was only about 100 yards up the road. He called 911 at 7:43 p.m. and reported the accident. He described where the car was and that the driver was a young woman who appeared uninjured but shaken. The dispatcher said they'd send an officer to the scene. What happened in the next few minutes is a mystery. Between Butch Atwood's 911 call at 7:43 p.m. and when the first police officer arrived at the scene at 7:46 p.m., Maura disappeared. When Officer Cecil Smith from Haverhill Police arrived at the crash scene just minutes after the 911 call, Maura's car was still there, but Maura was gone. The car was locked. The airbags were deployed. The windshield was cracked from the inside, but there was no sign of Maura anywhere. Officer Smith walked around the car and the immediate area calling for Maura. No response. He looked in the windows of the car. He could see Maura's belongings inside. A box of wine had spilled and there was red liquid that looked like blood, but was actually wine on the driver's seat. The car keys were missing. Maura's purse and cell phone were not visible in the car. Officer Smith checked with Butch Atwood to see if Maura had come to his house. She hadn't. Smith checked with neighbors. Nobody had seen where Maura went. More police units arrived. They searched the immediate area more thoroughly. They walked the road in both directions. They checked the woods near the crash site. They shined flashlights into the trees. They called Maura's name. Nothing. It was as if Maura had vanished into thin air. The temperature that night was around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. If Maura had wandered into the woods, she wouldn't survive long. She was wearing jeans, a jacket, and winter boots based on what her car contained. But that wouldn't be enough in those temperatures for more than an hour or two. Police called in search dogs. On February 11th, 2 days after the crash, search dogs were brought to the scene. One dog tracked Maura's scent from her car about 100 yards east on Route 112. Then the scent disappeared completely. This suggested Maura had walked away from her car along the road and then gotten into another vehicle. But whose vehicle? And where did they go? No drivers came forward saying they'd picked up a young woman that night. Maura's family was notified of her disappearance. Her father, Fred Murray, drove up from Massachusetts immediately. The family couldn't understand what had happened. Where was Maura going? Why had she left campus? Why had she lied about a death in the family? And where was she now? Police searched Maura's dorm room and car. For clues, they found a printout of directions to the White Mountains. They found information about condos and hotels in the area, like Maura had been planning a trip. As the investigation continued, more details about Maura's state of mind emerged. Her family revealed that Maura had been struggling with some personal issues. She'd been having problems with her boyfriend. She'd been stressed about school. And most significantly, Maura had been caught using a stolen credit card a few days before she disappeared. She'd used someone else's credit card number to order food delivery to campus. She'd been found out and was supposed to appear before the university judicial board. She might have been expelled for this. Was Maura running away from her problems? Was this a planned disappearance? But if Maura ran away, where did she go? She had less than $300. Her credit cards and ATM card were never used after she withdrew the $280. Her cell phone was never turned on after the crash. She made no contact with family, friends, or her boyfriend. If she wanted to disappear and start a new life, she'd need money, identification, and a plan. There was no evidence she had any of that. Extensive searches of the White Mountains area turned up nothing. Search teams hiked trails, searched abandoned buildings, checked nearby towns. Divers searched bodies of water. Helicopters flew search patterns. Dogs tracked different scents. Nothing. Maura had completely disappeared. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. Maura Murray was never found. Over the years, there have been countless theories about what happened to Maura. Some people believe she ran away and is living under a new identity somewhere. Some believe she wandered into the woods and died from exposure, and her body hasn't been found yet. Some believe she was picked up by someone with bad intentions and was murdered. Some believe she hitchhiked away and had an accident, or met foul play somewhere else. Some believe she committed suicide. Every theory has problems, and no theory fully explains all the facts. One theory that's been investigated extensively is that Maura was picked up by a local man with a history of violence. There was a man who lived near the crash site who had previous convictions for assault. Police investigated him thoroughly, but found no evidence linking him to Maura's disappearance. His house and property were searched multiple times. Nothing. Another theory is that Maura went into the woods intentionally to die. Maybe she'd been planning suicide. Maybe that's why she left campus, bought alcohol, drove to a remote area. Maybe the crash wasn't an accident, but a failed suicide attempt. When that didn't work, maybe she walked into the woods to freeze to death. But if this was the case, why hasn't her body been found? Search teams covered extensive ground in the area. Hunters and hikers frequent those woods. Surely someone would have come across remains in the past 20 years. Maura's father, Fred, has spent years searching for his daughter. He's gone to New Hampshire countless times. He's put up missing person posters. He's talked to locals. He's searched the woods himself. He's hired private investigators. He's followed up on every tip and lead. He's never given up hope of finding Maura, or at least finding out what happened to her. But after nearly 20 years, Maura Murray remains missing. Her disappearance is one of the most baffling missing persons cases in American history. To this day, people discuss and debate what happened to Maura Murray. There are online forums, podcasts, documentaries, and books dedicated to her case. Armchair detectives analyze every detail, propose new theories, argue about evidence. But nobody knows the truth. Maura Murray drove to the White Mountains on February 9th, 2004, crashed her car, and vanished. Where she went and what happened to her remains a mystery. Now let's move to our sixth and final story. This takes us to Nome, Alaska, in January 2017, and involves a brutal murder during one of the coldest winters on record. Nome is a small city on the western coast of Alaska with a population of about 3,500 people. In January, Nome is dark almost all day. Temperatures regularly drop below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the isolation is extreme. The nearest city of any size is hundreds of miles away. Nome is connected to the outside world primarily by air travel because there are no roads leading in or out. In January 2017, a young Alaska Native woman named Florence Okpialuk went missing. Florence was 26 years old. She was Inupiaq, part of the indigenous people of Alaska. Florence had grown up in Nome and had lived there her whole life. She worked at a local store and lived with her boyfriend of 3 years, Jason Moore, and their 4-year-old daughter, Sophia. Florence was known in the community as a kind person who always had a smile. She was a loving mother who adored her daughter. On January 15th, 2017, Florence worked her usual shift at the AC Value Center, a local store. She was a cashier and worked from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. It was a Monday, a normal workday. The temperature outside was -15 degrees with wind chill, making it feel like -30. The sun barely rose that day, just a brief twilight before darkness returned. This was typical for Nome in January. Florence finished her shift at 6 p.m. She bundled up in her heavy winter coat, hat, scarf, and gloves. She said goodbye to her coworkers and left the store. Florence didn't have a car. She walked to and from work every day. The walk from the store to her house was about 15 minutes, roughly 8 blocks. In summer, this would be a pleasant walk. In January, in the dark and cold, it was brutal, but Florence was used to it. She'd grown up in Nome and was accustomed to the extreme winter conditions. Florence started walking home on her usual route. She walked down Front Street toward her neighborhood. When Florence didn't arrive home by 6:30 p.m., her boyfriend Jason started to worry. Florence was reliable. She always came straight home from work. By 7 p.m., Jason was calling her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. He called again, same thing. He called the store to see if Florence was still there. Her coworkers said she'd left at her usual time. Jason waited another hour, thinking maybe Florence had stopped somewhere or was helping someone. But by 8 p.m., Jason knew something was wrong. He called the Nome Police Department to report Florence missing. Nome is a small town where everybody knows everybody. When word spread that Florence was missing, the community immediately mobilized. Police officers started searching. Volunteers joined them. They walked Florence's route from the store to her house, calling her name, checking yards and alleyways. Nome only has a few dozen streets. It didn't take long to search the main areas, but there was no sign of Florence. Her cell phone was either dead or turned off because it wasn't pinging any towers. The search continued through the night. The temperature dropped to -25 degrees. Search teams were out in these brutal conditions looking for Florence. They checked every building Florence might have gone into. They checked with friends and family. Nobody had seen her. Police reviewed security camera footage from businesses along Florence's route. They found footage of Florence leaving the store at 6:05 p.m. She was alone, walking with her head down against the wind. The cameras tracked her for several blocks. The last camera that caught her was at 6:12 p.m., about halfway between the store and her house. After that, Florence disappeared from view. As Tuesday turned into Wednesday with no sign of Florence, police feared the worst. In those temperatures, someone couldn't survive outside for long without shelter. If Florence was injured or incapacitated somewhere, she would have frozen to death by now. Search teams expanded their search area. They checked abandoned buildings, storage sheds, and vehicles. They used search dogs. One dog picked up Florence's scent along her walking route, but lost it at a corner about 2 blocks from her house. The scent just ended, as if Florence had gotten into a vehicle there. Police started looking at the possibility of foul play. Had someone picked up Florence? Had someone forced her into a vehicle? They started interviewing people, asking if anyone had been driving in that area around 6 p.m. on January 15th. They checked traffic cameras and security footage from nearby areas. They were trying to identify every vehicle that had been on the streets around that time. Days passed. Florence's family and the Nome community were desperate. Her daughter Sophia kept asking where mommy was. Jason was beside himself with worry and grief. Florence's parents and siblings were frantically helping with searches and distributing missing person flyers. But there was no trace of Florence. A week went by, then another week. Florence was still missing. On January 22nd, 2017, 1 week after Florence disappeared, 2 hunters were out on the tundra about 8 miles northeast of Nome. They were hunting ptarmigan, a type of bird. As they were walking through a remote area near the beach, one of the hunters spotted something in the snow. It looked like clothes. As they got closer, they realized it was a body partially buried in snow. They immediately called police. Officers responded to the location. They confirmed it was a human body. The body was frozen solid. It appeared to be a woman of small stature. The body was transported to the state medical examiner's office in Anchorage for autopsy and identification. Dental records confirmed the body was Florence Alkpaluk. Florence had been found, but she was dead. The autopsy revealed Florence had died from hypothermia. Her body temperature had dropped so low that her organs shut down and she froze to death. But there were also signs of trauma. Florence had bruising on her face and neck. She had defensive wounds on her hands, like she'd tried to fight someone off. Her clothes were torn. The medical examiner determined the manner of death was homicide. Florence hadn't simply wandered off and frozen. Someone had assaulted her and left her to die in the snow. Police started a murder investigation. Who had killed Florence? And how had her body ended up 8 miles outside of town? Florence didn't have a car. She couldn't have walked that far, especially not in the condition she'd been in. Someone had to have driven her body there. Investigators processed the crime scene where Florence's body was found. They looked for tire tracks, footprints, any physical evidence. The snow and wind had covered most tracks, but they found some evidence of vehicle activity in the area. Police went back and reviewed everything they knew. Florence had disappeared while walking home from work. Her scent had been lost at a corner 2 blocks from her house, suggesting she got into a vehicle there. Her body was found 8 miles out of town in a remote area. Someone had driven her there. Police started focusing on people who had vehicles and who would have been in the area on January 15th. One person who quickly became a suspect was Florence's boyfriend, Jason Moore. In domestic violence cases, the intimate partner is always the first suspect. Police looked closely at Jason. They discovered that Jason and Florence's relationship had been rocky recently. They'd been arguing about money and about Jason's drinking. Neighbors had heard them fighting. When police questioned Jason more closely, his story started to fall apart. Jason had told police he'd been home all evening on January 15th, waiting for Florence. But when investigators checked his vehicle's GPS, they found he'd been driving that evening. The GPS showed Jason's truck had been near the store around 6 p.m. It also showed the truck had driven to the area where Florence's body was found. This was damning evidence. Jason had lied about being home. He'd been out driving, and his truck had gone to the exact location where Florence's body was discovered. On January 25th, 3 days after Florence's body was found, police arrested Jason Moore. During interrogation, Jason initially stuck to his story, but when confronted with the GPS evidence, he started to break. After several hours, Jason confessed. He admitted he and Florence had gotten into an argument that morning before she went to work. Florence had told Jason she was planning to leave him and take Sophia. She said she'd had enough of his drinking and his temper. Jason had been angry all day. When Florence got off work, Jason had driven to the store area and waited for her. He'd been drinking. When he saw Florence walking home, he'd pulled up next to her and told her to get in the truck so they could talk. Florence had refused at first, but Jason had insisted. Eventually, she got in, probably to avoid a scene on the street. Jason drove out of town while they argued. The argument escalated. Jason was yelling. Florence was telling him it was over. Jason lost his temper. He hit Florence. She tried to fight back. He hit her again. He put his hands around her throat and squeezed. Florence struggled, but Jason was stronger. He strangled her until she stopped moving. Jason panicked when he realized Florence was dead or dying. He was in a remote area northeast of town. It was dark and brutally cold. He made a decision. He dragged Florence's body out of the truck and left her in the snow. Then he drove back to town and called police, pretending to be a worried boyfriend, reporting his girlfriend missing. Jason thought the cold and snow would destroy evidence. He thought if Florence's body was found, it would look like she'd wandered off and frozen. He didn't account for the fact that Florence had injuries and that investigators would determine she'd been murdered. He also didn't account for GPS tracking in his vehicle. Jason Moore was charged with first-degree murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The GPS data placed his truck at the crime scene. His confession provided details that only the killer would know. Forensic evidence linked Jason to Florence's injuries. Jason's lawyer tried to argue that Jason hadn't meant to kill Florence, that it was a fight that went too far, that it should be manslaughter, not murder. But the prosecution argued that Jason had deliberately strangled Florence and then callously left her to freeze to death in the tundra. That showed intent and depravity. The trial took place in late 2017. The prosecution presented all the evidence. They called Florence's family and friends who testified about the relationship problems. They called forensic experts who explained Florence's injuries and cause of death. They presented the GPS evidence. They played Jason's confession. The defense tried to minimize Jason's actions, painting him as a man who'd lost control in a moment of anger. But the jury wasn't sympathetic. On November 18, 2017, Jason Moore was convicted of first-degree murder. On January 12, 2018, he was sentenced to 99 years in prison. He won't be eligible for parole until he's served at least 80 years. Jason will die in prison for killing Florence Okpiluk. Florence's family was devastated by her death. Her daughter Sophia lost her mother and her father, growing up to be raised by Florence's parents. Florence's community mourned her loss. She was one of too many Alaska Native women who've been murdered or gone missing in Alaska. The rates of violence against Indigenous women in Alaska are staggeringly high, far above the national average. Florence became another tragic statistic, another life stolen by domestic violence. These 6 winter horror stories show how cold, isolation, and darkness can make tragedies even more devastating. James Kim died in the snow trying to save his family. Susan Powell disappeared during a winter storm and was never found. Teresa Halbach was murdered and her body burned. Troy LaFerrara was lured to his death by a twisted couple. Maura Murray vanished in the winter mountains. Florence Okpiluk was murdered and left to freeze. Winter claimed them all in different ways. Thank you for watching. If you found this content compelling, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.